Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. This is Singh Garewal from Kasten Marketing, and I'm delighted to have with me Vaibhav Kamra, VP Engineering and co-founder at Kasten. As you know, day two challenges like backup and DR must be faced when it comes to putting Kubernetes in production. Vaibhav is going to discuss these challenges and how K10 from Kasten makes backup and mobility easy. During the webinar, you will be in listen-only mode to help with sound quality, but please do put in your questions through the Q&A panel and we will get to them at the end. Over to you, Vaibhav.
Thank you, Singh. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. As Singh mentioned, I'm going to talk about Kubernetes backup and mobility. We're going to talk about the pain points customers are facing and how K10 makes this very easy for them to solve. Before we get started, a little bit of information about myself. So my name is Vaibhav Kamra. I'm the CTO and co-founder here at Kasten. At Kasten, we're working with customers who are moving applications over to Kubernetes, and we help them with their data management challenges. Both myself as well as a lot of us in the team, we've been working with Kubernetes since the pre-1.0 days. First, as users of Kubernetes ourselves, running our infrastructure on top of that, but also over the last few years, helping customers with their journey as they move a lot of their critical applications over to Kubernetes. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is going to be using customer data points and what we've learned over the last few years. Before Kasten, I led the engineering teams building the Cloud Boost family of products at EMC. Cloud Boost was a data protection product focused on cloud-based applications. And before that, I've been working on distributed file systems, storage systems, and databases throughout my career. Here's a snapshot of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start off talking about what are the pain points when it comes to Kubernetes data management, specifically backup and recovery, and why are customers, what challenges do they face? We will then talk a little bit about K10. But we'll quickly jump into a live demo. There's nothing like a live demo to actually put everything in perspective. So we'll spend some time on the live demo to show you all of this in action. And then hopefully that will lead into some good Q&A at the end, right? So as we get started, I want to really talk about where customers are. What are they doing with Kubernetes? And this is a survey that came out from the CNCF a couple of weeks ago. And what's really interesting here is this graph on the right. What this is showing is really the increase of workloads that are moving into production. As of now, 84% of respondents talk about their workloads being in production. And this mirrors what we've also been seeing with our customers. Customers have moved past the point of trying out Kubernetes, figuring out what infrastructure they want to use, doing POCs with a few application teams. And really now, a lot of these applications are making their way into production. The other data point here that's really interesting is the widespread adoption of storage in these environments. And really that indicates what kind of applications customers are running here. We've moved past just running stateless applications in these environments. And a lot of customers are now running stateful applications over here. If you look at the cloud environments, every cloud provider has their native storage, which is very popular in those environments. And then if you go on-prem, every storage vendor now has first-class integration into Kubernetes. So this is really driving the adoption and use of stateful applications in these environments. But as customers are now moving into production with these applications or getting ready to go there, the focus has now changed. The kind of challenges that are top of mind are no longer how am I going to build my application, what infrastructure should I use, but really these day two challenges, which are how am I going to deal with data loss? What happens if my infrastructure goes down? Am I compliant with my auditing requirements? What's my DR story? Am I going to be able to move my application between clouds from an on-prem environment to a cloud if that's important? How do upgrades work in these environments? And as you introduce stateful applications, this really becomes a pain point that you need to address. And what customers are finding is that their existing solutions or solutions that they have at hand really aren't working for them. Whether it be leveraging their existing VM or infrastructure data protection solutions. What this typically, using these, typically you end up with, given what the workloads look like, you either end up with capturing portions of the application or not capturing any of the application itself. The analogy I like to use is that if you're backing up a VM and trying to get all the application containers running on it, it's similar to, for example, in a VM environment, backing up a bare metal server and trying to get all the VMs from there. You might be getting some backup or some data, but at the end of the day, when you start looking at what your restore procedure is going to be, it becomes very complicated, and it really leaves you exposed in terms of data loss. The other approach we've seen, and this is really a lot of teams, when they're at the POC stage with their applications, they tend to put together scripts for their application. And what we find here is that these tend to be very tailored to the application itself. It works when I have maybe one application running in my environment. But as things start to scale, these don't really evolve. They're often tied to a certain infrastructure, and they really lock down what opportunities you have to move to different infrastructure, or if production is different from dev or dev test environment. And they're just difficult to maintain. Operation teams really hate this, and that's what the issues here are. And then finally, relying on storage systems. So if I have a storage system that's doing some kind of snapshot or backup, relying on that really doesn't work again. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But what you're really grabbing here is just the data piece of the application at the lowest level. You have no insight into the application itself. You run into issues where snapshots really aren't backups, and other issues there. So these are the kind of issues that customers are hitting with their existing tools. Now, what is the right approach here? And to understand what the right approach is, I think it's first really important to understand what the applications look like, and actually what production environments are looking like in Kubernetes. So first, let's focus on what a typical cloud native application looks like. They typically have a microservice architecture. So I have a very simplified version here on this slide, where you can see that I've got 3 microservices in this application. Those are those pods over there. One which is stateless, the one right on the top. I've got 2 stateful pods, one which is using just a raw volume. The other one might actually be a data service like MySQL or Postgres. And you might actually have 1 or more of these in your application. And what's important to understand is that the application is not just what's on the raw volume or in the database. It's actually a lot more than that. It's the config map. It's the secret I need to get to that database. It's the networking information. It's the certificates. It's all of that information that is now, that used to be, for example, inside the VM itself, but is now part of the application definition within Kubernetes, that is required if you want to bring back the application, if you ever want to recover the application. And as you start to look at production, and so let's look at a customer of ours who's actually running in production and what their environment looks like with these applications. So this is a real customer who is running Kubernetes on AWS. They're using both Ceph as well as AWS EBS in this environment. One of their production clusters has 54 nodes. They are running 173 different applications here. And these are 173 applications built by different teams, all deploying into the same environment. And operations teams over here are challenged with managing all of this. Multiple terabytes of data, hundreds of volumes. And then when you start to drill down into the components that I was talking about earlier, it starts to get really interesting. Over 2,000 different pods over here. So 2,000 different services that are distributed across these 54 nodes, thousands of secrets, service accounts, role bindings, over 18,000 different components over here that an operations team needs to manage without having that deep understanding into what the applications themselves are. Okay. So when you start to look at the environment, these environments, as well as what applications look like, this is why we did things at Kasten a little differently. And what our approach really is to treat applications as the operational unit. When you talk to users or application developers or operations teams and ask them what they're doing, it really is deploying an application, creating an application, using one, recovering an application. Those are their use cases. They're not really talking about managing databases or managing volumes anymore. It's really this application that's what they care about. So the Kasten approach really is to focus on the application as the operational unit to automatically discover what are all the different components of the application and capture them in a consistent manner and take away that complexity from operations teams or the application developers. We want to give our customers the freedom to choose whatever infrastructure they want to use. Kubernetes and containers is all about agility. You want to be able to use the best of breed to build your applications, and you want to use the best infrastructure that's most suited to you. So you don't want to lock someone into a specific storage system, into a specific database. You want to give customers that choice. But then what Kasten does is really to abstract all of that infrastructure, take on the complexity of managing data with that so that customers don't need to deal with it. And then finally, coordinating operations across these different infrastructure types, storage systems, databases, Kubernetes infrastructure, making sure we handle both backup as well as restore procedures so that everything is fully automated. Manual just does not work in these environments. And to address that is really why we built K10. And so K10 is the K10 platform enables everything that I just talked about. It does full application discovery. So operations teams really don't need to be talking one-on-one with each application developer to figure out what their application is doing. Everything in our platform is policy driven. It is all fully automated. As I mentioned, manual operations just do not work here. We abstract all the complexity behind a very simple, easy to use, both API as well as dashboard. And then end-to-end security is built in. And this is critical when you're dealing with data at this scale. And I think when you're dealing with data, period, you need to make sure security is built into the platform. So all the way from things like support for different authentication schemes, role-based access control, encryption end-to-end, customer managed keys. These are all built into the platform and available from day one. So this hopefully gives everyone a brief introduction about what the challenges are and what the product is trying to solve. But to really put this into perspective, I'm going to jump into a live demo. So let me switch screens over here. First off, I just want to quickly talk about how you get K10 set up in your environment. Installing K10 in your environment, and we support a variety of different distributions, which we'll talk about later, is just a single line command. We're distributed as a Helm chart, and for most environments, it is just running a single Helm command to install in your environment. Once you are installed, so I'm actually going to show you what a Kubernetes cluster looks like with Kasten installed there. So I have a EKS cluster set up over here. And if I go look at the cluster itself, I've got a 3-node cluster. And if I look at what namespaces are inside this cluster, you can see that I've got Kasten installed in its own namespace, and I have a bunch of other kind of applications installed in this environment. Okay. To show you with a picture what you're going to see for the demo first, I'm going to show what backup and recovery of these applications looks like in this environment. And really, this is going to be the setup we're dealing with. So we have that EKS cluster that I talked about. We've got K10 installed in its own namespace. I've got a very simple MySQL application installed in its own namespace. And what we're going to demonstrate is how K10 backs up that application and moves it into an object storage target. Okay. So now switching back over here to my browser, when you install K10 in your environment, we automatically install our dashboard as well. And this is what that dashboard looks like for that Kubernetes cluster that I talked about. So let's get a little familiar with what the dashboard is. First off, talking about application discovery. K10 automatically discovers what are all the applications running in this environment, as well as indicates to you which ones have data protection policies associated with them, which ones are actually not managed by any policies. So this gives you a quick way of knowing where if you're covered or if you have something where you're exposed. But it's not just about discovering the applications itself. So if I dive into this, it's actually discovering all the components of the application. So if I go pick an example like that MySQL application that I have running, you can go and see, look at the details for that. And we've automatically discovered what are all the Kubernetes labels, what are all the data components, what workloads I have, what networking components I have, what configuration I have. All of that is automatically discovered by the platform itself. All right, so we'll come back to this view in a little bit for the demo. The next piece on the dashboard that I want to talk about is the policies page. So this is where you set up that automation for your data protection jobs. And everything, like I said, is fully automated, and we'll go set up a job in a few seconds. The other one on the dashboard that's interesting is really the activity page. So over here, you get to see all the activity that's been going on in the system, as well as what are all the jobs that are running, have run, and get history on all of that. Okay. So first thing I'm going to do is actually go into my policies page, and I'm going to set up a new policy for an application in my environment. And just to show you on the command line what that application looks like, this is going to be this MySQL demo application here. So if I go and switch to that, and I'm going to list everything that we saw in there. So you can see that this application has a persistent volume that it's using, that is actually using EBS. There's a single pod over here. There's networking information. There's a deployment or workload information. There's all sorts of other components here. So switching back to my dashboard, the way I would set up data protection is just to create a policy, which I'm going to call demo in this case. Describe what the action is. So I'm going to be snapshotting the application, set up what frequency I want to snapshot at. I can even get more granular if needed. I can set up retention. So we support a full GFS retention style. So I can control which snapshot, how many hourly snapshots, what should get promoted, how many weekly snapshots, dailies, all of those things. So I'm just going to go with the default schedule over here. And then finally, what I can do is this configures local snapshots, but I can also then configure these snapshots to go to a backup target. So in this case, I'm going to have them go to an S3 bucket that I've previously created. And you can also control how often these local snapshots should be moved into that bucket. So I'm going to move every snapshot in this case, as well as control the retention of those backups in your bucket independently from your local snapshots. Then finally, you get to select which applications this policy should apply to. Now, you can get as granular or as broad as you want. You can pick a specific application. So in our case, I want to pick that MySQL demo application. But you can also create very broad policies. So you can, with Kubernetes labels, you can say everything that has the app MySQL label, I want to protect that, or an app backup label, I want to go protect that. And what that allows you to do is actually create these forward-looking policies that will apply to future applications that show up in this environment. So here I'm just going to pick a specific application. I'm going to pick up that MySQL demo application. And you have the flexibility of saying, do I want to capture everything? That's the default. Or do I want to be very specific about what I'm capturing? Things like persistent volumes, things like pods. If I want to get very granular, I'm just going to pick the default in this case. And that's really all that's needed. Now, before I go and actually create this policy, I want to click this YAML button. And when I click this YAML button, what you're seeing is this is actually the API behind what this policy is. Everything that you see on the dashboard, everything that I'm doing here is actually enabled by our API and can be done on the command line as well. And our API itself is a Kubernetes API. What that means is it's a very familiar construct. You don't need any special tooling to integrate with our API layer. So let me go ahead and create that policy. And now if I switch back to the dashboard, the first thing you'll observe is my compliant applications went from 3 to 4, because now one of the applications I did not have a policy for now has one. The other thing now that you'll start to see is that I've got some actions that are starting to run. First, we're going to get that backup of the application itself, and then we're going to export that into that S3 target over there. Okay. So the backup just completed, and after that finishes, what you're going to see is that exports start to happen to the object store location. So while that starts to happen, what I want to then show is now see what's happened with the application. So if I go back to my applications view and I go look at that demo application, what you can see is it is now compliant. And now I actually have a restore point. And this restore point is of 10:21 a.m., the one I just took. And when I start to look at what is inside this restore point, you can see that it has snapshots for the volumes itself. We've captured all the config maps, the deployments, the secrets, service accounts, everything that makes up that application has now been captured as part of this restore point. And what this now allows me to do is either restore in place, or I can actually clone the same application as a different one in a different namespace. So in this case, I'm actually going to go ahead and clone. So I'm going to call that MySQL demo 2. And I'm going to go ahead and trigger that operation. We also support applying transforms as you're doing the restore. So as you're doing the restore, if you want to change things like my storage type, or you want to change what availability zone you're running in, or you want to change what the API resources are. Let's say you're doing an upgrade and something's changed in the API resources. All of that can be done very easily through a transformation mechanism over here. Here, I'm just going to do a simple clone, and I'm going to go hit restore and let that continue. So let's switch back to the dashboard again. And what you'll see on the dashboard, first off, that backup and that export to the object store location is completed. And now we actually have a restore operation going on. And to see what's happening in the cluster, let's switch back to my command line. I'm going to clear the screen over here. And if I go look at the namespaces, you'll see that I now have this new application, this new namespace that was created called MySQL demo 2 that was created 29 seconds ago. And if I go switch to that and go list again what's happening in that, you'll see that we've created a new volume in that from our backup. So that was created 35 seconds ago. We've got a new pod, a new MySQL pod that is now running in that namespace. It's starting up. We've brought back the services, the deployment, everything that made up that application is now available in that new environment, in that new cluster, in that new namespace. Okay. All right, and that restore is now completed, and so that application is now up and running. So switching back to slides, what we saw right now, what the demo showed us was how backup and recovery work. The next thing I actually want to talk about is how you can not just restore in the same cluster, but this, now that you've taken this backup, how you can recover this in a different cluster. Let's say if you're doing an upgrade or if you're just recovering from a site failure. So again, let me switch back to my dashboard over here. What I want to show is I have Kasten installed in another cluster. So this is that K10 demo 2 cluster. And you can see over here, I only have one default application installed in this environment. I don't really have anything else. And now, given the policy that I had set up previously in the first cluster, I'm going to grab the details of where to import. And what I can do in the second cluster is now just set up an import policy. So an import policy allows me to import from that cloud storage location. So in this case, I'm going to say import from S3. I'm going to say that this policy should automatically restore the application after importing it. Again, you have all the flexibility with restore. You can have granular restores. You can apply transforms if needed. You can say how often you want this import to run. So for example, if I have a policy that's exporting every hour from a cluster, maybe I want to import into a different environment on the same frequency, or maybe every day. In this case, I'm going to just say hourly, and I'm going to put that text in there that tells me where I can import from. Just going to pull it in from import S3, and I'm going to go ahead and create that policy over here. Again, going back to the dashboard, this should be very familiar now for all of us. You create a policy, dashboard shows you what the operations are. What I should start to see very shortly is that import policy kick in, which it did, and it imports the restore point now into this cluster. And once the restore point is imported into this cluster, I can go ahead and restore that. And in this case, since the policy was set up to restore automatically, you can see that that restore has kicked off. Now, if I go and actually switch to this cluster on the command line, again, this is my EKS2 cluster, again, 3 nodes, and I go look at what the namespaces are, you'll see that that MySQL demo application has now started to get created in this new cluster. So if I switch there, and if I do the same, list all the pods, and other components, you'll start to see that, yes, we've created a new volume here from the volume that we had backed up, excuse me, and we're bringing up a new pod and a new service in this new cluster. And this should complete shortly. So, which it just did. And so what we just showed you over here is, switching back to slides, is taking that restore point that I had moved into object storage and actually importing it into another cluster. Now, we used an EKS cluster, but Kasten K10 allows you to import in a different environment if you need to. This could be GKE, this could be something on-prem, and then actually restoring that application in this environment. Okay. So that's my demo. Now, what we just saw was a demo that was running all in EKS. And actually, this setup that we just demoed mirrors one of our production customers. This is a global 10 financial services customer. They're running everything in EKS. This is kind of what their environment looks like, where they have multiple production and sub-production clusters where we're deployed. And they're using K10 because of the reasons we talked about. It's built for Kubernetes. It really simplifies, abstracts all the complexity of dealing with Kubernetes and the underlying infrastructure for them. It's very fast to deploy. We saw how it's just a single command to deploy in your environment. It's API first, and what they really like is the UI and the UX, which is very simple for them to achieve their backup and recovery goals. And then finally, as you can imagine with financial services, end-to-end security is really key. The fact that we have enterprise-grade encryption built in, we integrate with key management systems, we have full support for things like AWS IAM, role-based access control, authentication. This is really important in this environment. But it's not just EKS that we support. K10, as we mentioned before, supports a variety of different Kubernetes distributions and managed services. So all the different cloud providers, as well as most of what you're going to find on-prem. We also have integrations into all the storage providers out there, things like NetApp, Pure Storage. We have full support for things like Ceph and the CSI interface now, which allows us to integrate with almost every storage provider out there, as well as first-class integration into data services themselves. So we focused a lot on volume snapshots today, but we have first-class integrations with things like MySQL, MongoDB, Postgres, any other kind of data service that you see, which allows us to do not just volume snapshots to capture some of the data, but also do things at the application level to get application consistent backups, to do logical database backups, do things like point in time, incrementals, a variety of different kind of approaches over there. And to quickly show this in my dashboard as well, what you will notice, this was the backup we just did for our MySQL application. And you notice we actually were using volume snapshots here. So we snapshotted the underlying volume. Well, I have another application running here, and this is another instance of MySQL. And what you'll notice here is that we actually did not snapshot the volumes. What we've actually done here is actually taken a MySQL dump and captured the data at the database level. We've done the same for something like Postgres running over here, where we've actually can leverage things like PG dump or Wally to get point-in-time capabilities as well. So we have integration at different levels, both at the volume snapshot storage level, as well as data services and application level if needed. Okay. And finally, and this is going to be my last slide, we only scratched the surface. So the K10 platform has a lot more features at the data level, things like change block tracking, dedupe, and compression. At the metadata level, things like what we talked about earlier, the ability to transform specs when you're restoring, the ability to be very selective in terms of what you want to include or exclude, both in your backups as well as in your restores, a full global catalog so you can query all of this, you can see all of the information that you backed up. A lot of flexibility in how you set up your backup, DR, and mobility policies as best to meet your SLAs. The ability to do everything using policies, things like GFS retention, things like hooks, so you can actually hook in any custom logic you need for your applications, to whether it be to quiesce or go update DNS after you've done a recovery. Those kind of features are built into the platform. And then finally, operations is what we focus a lot on, making sure we make their life easy. And they don't have to deal with the complexity here. So a full enterprise dashboard, API first design, so you can not just use the dashboard, but you can integrate into any other tooling that you have in your enterprise, full monitoring, alerting, support for air-gapped environments if you're deploying on-prem, for example, DR and HA built into the platform. And that's really all I wanted to cover here. Hopefully this gives everyone a good picture of the pain points customers are facing and how K10 makes it very easy for them to address these challenges. We have a full-featured starter edition, which is listed on our website. This has all the features available. And so if anybody wants to try these, it's an easy download. It is a one-line install in your Kubernetes environment. And we're available to talk about this through the website as well as on Slack if needed. And with that, I think we should switch to Q&A.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Vaibhav. That was very interesting. I see one question here. Is K10 delivered as a service?
Is K10 deliver a service? No, K10 is actually software that runs in your own environment. It runs on your own infrastructure. We do not run a service. None of the data that we are capturing or working with is ever exposed outside of your environment.
Okay. Another question, it talks about what flavors of Azure Kubernetes do you support?
We integrate with upstream Kubernetes first of all. So that's the first thing we qualify with. So most distributions of Kubernetes, recent distributions, we do support. We also then go beyond that, which is to integrate with a variety of the managed services out there. So we support things like OpenShift, AKS, EKS, so from Azure, Google, offerings from AWS, and a variety of different distributions.
Okay, there's another question. Does K10 always have to be on a clustered environment?
Does K10 always have to be in a clustered environment? If I understand the question correctly, at least I'll give you my understanding. It's asking whether K10 needs to be deployed in Kubernetes. And that is correct. K10 integrates with Kubernetes. It is meant to be a cluster add-on for your Kubernetes environment.
Okay.
There's another question here which talks about what was the motivation for separating backup into backup and an export as two steps. Really what this does is it gives you the flexibility of having local snapshots versus snapshots that are exported into a backup target. Local snapshots then allow you to recover very fast and quickly if you just want to do things like recover in the same environment or do a clone. And then having these backups available in your backup target helps you with cases such as DR or recovering into a different cluster. And by separating this, again, you have the option of doing these separately if you need to, but when you create a policy, you're just creating a single policy to do all of this together. But it just gives you the flexibility of things like defining different schedules. So maybe you want to take local snapshots every hour, but only move these into an external backup target every night. So you get this flexibility with this approach.
Okay, another question is, does K10 just capture volume snapshots or can you also do logical?
That's a good question. I know most of my demo is actually focused on volume snapshots, but we can capture data at a variety of different levels or granularity. We can integrate with data services, like I mentioned, to do things like data service consistent backups, application consistent backups. We can actually integrate at the application level, so you can extract data in whatever mechanism you need. And we have a very extensible model as well, so it allows you to customize and integrate any custom data extraction or restore tooling you would like to use. Hopefully that was clear over there. Another question I see over here, saying, if you don't mind, I saw a couple here. Can Kasten K10 leverage NAS-based deduplication storage? So I think like data domain and exagrid, I think this is talking about what the backup targets are. Currently, we only support object storage as our backup targets, but a variety of systems do expose their dedupe storage via an object layer, so we do integrate with that. For example, I know with pure storage, that is one of the capabilities that we have leveraged. We are on our roadmap going forward is to start supporting NFS as a backup target as well, and that will support the use cases the customer was asking about. All right. There's another question about, is there a support matrix that is open for public? And I believe what this is asking about is, do we document everything we support? And the answer, I believe, Singh, is yes. Information should be available on our website, as well as docs.kasten.io.
Right.
That's really where it's open to the public. It talks about how you can install this in your own environment, and everything we support is listed over there.
Another question is, will K10 integrate with other tools in my environment?
That's a good question. And one of the things that I think I talked about was our API. Our API is all exposed as a Kubernetes API. What this means is, and it is a declarative API. What this means is both the API patterns as well as all the tooling need to use the API itself is not new. If you're using Kubernetes, you already have all of that. The other interesting thing is that any tool that you're using, for whether it be for CI/CD or it be for monitoring, whatever you're using already has that integration with both Kubernetes as well as, for example, our monitoring framework, which is through Prometheus. So it makes it very easy for you to integrate with our API. And it's not just what the API is, it is other things like what is our RBAC model and what is our authentication model. And that is all native Kubernetes. So again, this is all done to make it easy and seamless in customer environments. All right. There's another question over there which talks about, in the demo, some backups do snapshots of the persistent volumes. The others run database. I showed that you can actually use a database utility. How does this happen? How does K10 determine? Our goal is to make this very easy for customers. We have an open source framework called Canister, and Canister has a lot of blueprints in the repo, which talks about, there's a blueprint for MySQL, for Postgres, for all the different data services. So to use any one of these approaches, a customer simply needs to add an annotation to their application that they want to use a specific blueprint or a recipe. And then K10 will go ahead and use that recipe over there. What this also allows you to do is not just use kind of our stock implementations that we have for a specific database, but if you want to do something very custom, let's say you have a custom application, a custom data store, you can take one of those blueprints and modify them and integrate very easily into our platform. There is another question around how do we size the target backup storage for Kubernetes or for K10. Again, we're typically using object storage for our backup, so that the scale that they offer helps with this. What we also indicate, and I'll just quickly show you on our dashboard, when we also give you full visibility into what's happening with your data, how many snapshots do you have, what's happening, what are we pushing to object storage, how much dedupe we're getting, what our live storage is. And this allows you to kind of predict based on policies, how much storage am I going to need, what are going to be, how to size my backend backup target. Hopefully that answers the question.
So another question is, can I use K10 to upgrade a version for OpenShift, for example?
That's a good question. I think I talked very briefly about migration as a use case, as a pain point. And in fact, what we're seeing in these environments is that not a lot of customers are actually doing migration of their Kubernetes environments in place. The way migration or the way upgrades are happening is to actually create a new cluster and a different version and kind of migrate over into that cluster. And so migration is obviously challenging when you've got data with it associated with your application. And that's where K10 comes in. So we did demonstrate the use case where I moved an application from the first EKS cluster to the other EKS cluster. And this is how you would do your migration. And if you're doing things like upgrade, we also, with the transform capability, we allow you to, for example, change API versions that you might be using. You know, the recent Kubernetes 1.17 release that's going out, for example, has deprecated a whole set of APIs that were being used in previous versions. And using our capabilities and migrating your applications through K10, we could take care of that upgrade. Other use cases, such as that customers have actually used us in production for, are large lifts of things like OpenShift 3 to OpenShift 4. And we actually have customers who've publicly talked about how they've done this with us. There's another question here which talks about, is there any form of monitoring other than the dashboard? We do actually, everything that you see on the dashboard is really it is the live view. And then we have integration into Prometheus, where we expose all of these as metrics into Prometheus. So what that allows customers to do is, build their own dashboards if they need to, integrate with their own other dashboards that they might have, integrate into any monitoring system that they have, because they can get alerts for things like failed jobs or backups that are taking too long or things that never completed. All of that is fed through Prometheus. You can build email notifications over it, PagerDuty, whatever you need to do.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions. So I think we can close the webinar. Thank you very much, Weber, for that presentation and answering the questions. I'm sure it was very useful to the audience. And of course, I'd like to thank the audience for joining. Trust that you found it informative. And by all means, I would encourage you to go to our website, Kasten.io, and check it out, find more information, and reach out to us if we can help you in any way or answer any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.